construction class is going to join us, and that's Paul Ray in the construction room that you're seeing there.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Hi, Margaret.
Good morning.
Hey, I'm going to turn this off real quick and try and get it hooked up to this.
Oh, okay. Nice to see you guys.
Good morning, Margaret. It's Garian. How are you?
Oh, hi, Garian. Good morning.
Good morning.
Pretty awesome that, this is the first time that we've seen other people in our class, at least me.
Yeah, I know it is.
Weird because, normally you're so used to kids knowing who the group of that's working through the program.
Yeah. So this is pretty different.
Okay, so my name is Garian. I'm with the City of Eugene. It looks like we're hitting right about 10 o'clock. Margaret, should we wait a minute or two for any other students that might be joining?
I think because you have that 40-minute time limit, I think you should just go for it. Thank you for asking.
Okay. Well, thank you for that reminder. First, I wanted to say thank you to you, Margaret, for keeping this up, especially during these times we find ourselves in. It's the highlight of the season for a lot of us, being able to connect with your students.
Oh, ditto. Thank you so much for being here.
Perfect. Yeah, we appreciate it. A heads up to everyone, we are going to be recording this so Margaret can share it with her students that aren't able to be here today. And I'll be sending that recording out after the meeting. We do have 40 minutes. I'm sorry we can't have a super long meeting. I know everyone loves those. And so what city staff, what we would like to do is have each team member take 2 to 3 minutes to talk about their role in the permitting process, as well as offer any pro tips for people who may be new to submitting commercial and residential permits. And then after each person talks, Margaret and Margaret's class, we'd love to open it up for a few minutes so you have a moment to ask some questions of our reviewers. And so today we have with us Cheryl, the lead on our intake team. We have Dal, lead on our erosion team. We have Mike McCarrow with land use. We have Michelle, Public Works Permit Technician. We have Seda, Residential Plans Examiner. And then I'll go at the very end. I'm Garian with Commercial. So Cheryl, can you kick us off? Oh, are you on mute, Cheryl? Let's see. Is the mic not working? I'm gonna move to Dow while Cheryl figures out the mic. Maybe Adam might be available on our team for that. Okay. Dow, are you ready?
Yes, can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So I'm with the erosion program. It's actually called erosion prevention because our main emphasis is to prevent impacts to public stormwater system and related natural resources. So how this relates to building permits is that our permit wraps around a building permit. So that could be a residential single family development or an addition or a commercial permit or a demo permit or any other kind of permit that's issued by BPS that has site work associated with it. And what we do is we provide some guidance for measures that are intended to protect the adjacent properties and the public stormwater system, related natural resources from construction related impacts. So that includes dirt, of course, earthwork, but it also includes construction-related contaminants, sealants, paints, mortar, concrete washout, parking could be a construction impact, especially on a sensitive natural resource area. So that's that's kind of what our permit does. It requires you to have a plan, and then it requires you, if your site is greater than 1 acre, to do monitoring. So that is either weekly or daily monitoring of your project to ensure that the site is meeting the requirements of the permit, and any of the measures that are in place are properly installed and working. One of my pro tips I think I'd start off with is visit the site. So that's something that you see in a submittal where a designer clearly hasn't visited the site. They're not showing things in the right location. There's stuff missing, existing conditions that are missing. For erosion, because a lot of it has to do with rain and runoff and water, topography is very important. And so it often is hard to get good topography on a site unless you are fortunate enough to work on a project that has a survey. But then if you have the survey, you also kind of need to go out and ground truth it. So visit the site, make sure you know what you're dealing with, walk the perimeter of the site so you understand where the potential low spots are on the site. And then start with an existing conditions map. That should accurately reflect the contours or topography of the site, the buildings, streets, roads, lanes, driveways, other infrastructure. That would be underground infrastructure, should be on the existing conditions. So that's where your storm, your sanitary, water, power, gas, where are those located? Do you need to extend those into your site, or are they already there? If you have utilities that are coming from further away than at the edge of your site, because you have to extend the utility like a storm or a sanitary line, it has to be extended into the site for the development. Make sure you show that additional area of impact where extension of utilities will locate. That for erosion, that's all part of your site work. Then when you're putting your plan together, consider all construction phases. So for erosion, because we wrap around a project, we're usually the first inspector on the site and the last inspection you'll need to close out your project. So that means include clearing and grubbing areas, your mass grading and excavation plan, your utilities and footings plan. So that's getting everything underground in preparation for going vertical. Then of course the building construction itself, and then the paving and landscaping phases. All of that needs to be incorporated into your erosion plan. Check for contaminated soils or hazardous material issues. So some sites, when you're doing a redevelopment on a site especially, have a history of contaminated material. That could be oil and gas or other dry cleaner, various kinds of contaminants. Make sure you check to see if the site has any previously known contamination associated with it, and if there are permit conditions or requirements around DEQ around the cleanup of that material. Finally, my last tip is don't forget about wet weather construction. So Eugene has a very distinct weather pattern. We have generally dry summers, and we have all of our precip in the winter. So if you're doing wet weather construction, and in our code that's defined October 15th through April 30th, additional requirements are required for construction during that time frame. So don't forget to incorporate that into your planning if your project is going to have wet weather construction. There are specific BMPs and measures that are required during that time. So I think that's my 3 minutes.
And do you want to tell us what BMPs are?
Yes, BMPs are best management practices. So that would be any measure or action that you take to prevent or avoid impacts to public storm system. So an example might be you're scheduling a concrete pour on Wednesday. You check the weather and you see it's going to be pouring down rain on Wednesday. So you reschedule the concrete pour to the following week to avoid the weather. So that would be a practice. Another one would be a stabilized construction entrance. So often we rock our construction entrances to help remove mud and dirt from tires as they're rolling through the rock. And that would be another type of physical measure that you would use to during the mass excavation phase. Sediment fences are commonly known, wattles, those kinds of measures.
That's a great question, and thank you so much, Dal. It's very informative. I love being a part of this team because I learn something new almost every day. Are there any student questions for Dal before we move on to Cheryl from intake?
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me. I think we're not, I don't even know how to mute our system, but so you suggested we investigate whether there've been any hazardous materials on the site previous. What's your best way to figure that out?
DEQ has a database that you can check. So you can, if you know your tax lot number, I think you can access it by tax lot number. So
Okay.
if there's known contaminants, a history of contamination on the site or cleanup, DEQ website. You can also check with Michelle and her staff, I think. They also do research or have records related to that. Michelle, do you want to add anything to that?
The records that we have, we get from DEQ. They do regular dumps from their database. So since I'm going to recommend that you check in with my staff anyway, I would just incorporate that as part of the questions that you ask.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. And a heads up, I did just get a little message from Zoom that says right now we're not limited to 40 minutes. I don't know whether Zoom is coming or going these days. So,
Great.
So we'll keep going with our schedule. And thank you, Michelle, for providing that valuable information, and Dal as well. It's very interesting. Cheryl, looks like we're up and running.
Can you hear me? Okay. All right, very good. Well, my name is Cheryl, and I'm a permit intake technician. I work here at City with a team of 4. And what we do is we are the initial point of contact when someone is applying for a permit. We are looking at the documents submitted as an overall project. So of course there will be construction documents, but we take a look at the project as kind of a bigger picture. So we're looking at what is the zoning of the property, is what's being proposed allowed. We look at site specific pieces of it as well. We look to see if it's in a sensitive area, if it needs an erosion prevention permit. We look to see if there's any zoning restrictions. It's interesting to me that we have the building code, which tells us how to build something, but then we also have the local zoning code, which tells you what you can and can't do on the property. So those are all important pieces to take a look at when you're applying for permits. One of the things that a lot of our applicants struggle with is their site plans. If you are, let's say, for example, converting a garage, we're going to look to see that you are allowing enough space between your front property line and the garage that you can no longer park in, to see that you have ample room to park and you aren't restricted and need to park on the street. Those aren't always really intuitive. I mean, if it is a internal remodel and there's no new square footage, a lot of times people overlook that. So one of the things I would recommend when you are getting ready to submit permits, or even before you get started on the project, once you're familiar with what it is, I would reach out to the local jurisdiction and ask questions. Let them know what the location is. There may be some particular restrictions that have to do with, say, number of plumbing fixtures or number of bedrooms that are allowed. And it always is helpful to save time. And in the long run, it saves money for your customer. when you do it that way. And it also makes the city staff really happy. We don't like to send things back. But oftentimes we have to. We're always happy to take as much time as we can with customers when they reach out and ask questions. We can do some basic research up front, and it's my experience has been that those projects flow a lot more smoothly through the permitting process. I would also say that as you move forward and you are applying for permits, every submittal will probably teach you something. And I will tell you, nobody gets it perfect the first time. Even folks that have been preparing construction documents and applying for permits, there seems to always be something that's overlooked. So I would encourage you to take that as an opportunity to do better on the next project. Take that information with you. And my pro tip for you is make sure that the document size that you submit leaves enough room for the city to put comments and notes on it. Oftentimes we'll see where someone has tried to put all of the information that they have, whether it's an elevation plan, a roof framing plan, a floor plan, cross section, all on one piece of paper, and it doesn't leave us room to make any notes. So less is more when it comes to space. I can't think of any more tips. Have I gotten to 3 minutes yet?
Oh, this is great, Cheryl. I know the one that we've had some good times with is the file naming when people are uploading to eBuild.
Right. So our process is all electronic now. I've been here for a while, so I have had the pleasure of being a part of the paper world, where people bring their plans in and you get to sit down with them and you flip pages and you get to carry big rolls of plans around, especially for the big commercial projects. Our process is pretty, it's pretty simple to navigate. We have a lot of information out there. But again, every jurisdiction is a little bit different. Everybody has a different process. So as far as navigating our eBuild system, I would say, again, the key to success would be to reach out and ask questions. We're always happy to help. And if you have the opportunity to apply for permits with City of Eugene, as you're working your way through the process, there's no bad question. Everything that you come to us for, anything that you ask us for, we're happy to do, and it's only going to make the process easier for you. Questions, anybody?
I have a question.
Mhm.
When you're getting ready to do a project, does the city of Eugene maintain like records of the existing stuff so you can go get the existing records like blueprints?
That's a really good question. On commercial projects, typically we have records. On residential projects, in the past, we follow state archiving procedures, and we are required to maintain those records for 2 years. Now that things have become more digital, we have access to more residential actual plans. We will always have application information, contractor information, inspection history, certificates of occupancy. So if you are looking for house plans or a site plan from when the house was originally built, and that happened 20 years ago, in that instance, we may or may not have that record to share with you. If it was built just a couple of years ago, then the answer is likely yes, we do. Did that answer your question?
Yes. And then I had one, I don't know if you know this one, but when you're building on a piece of ground that's, it's 3/4 of an acre and you're coming down and the whole thing's a leach field and it drops about 3 foot within that 3/4 of an acre. Do you have to raise the whole ground out level and change the leach field, or can you build on an angle and just go bigger on the lower side? Or is that something?
Who can answer that question?
Might be an erosion issue.
It might be.
That might be a bit technical for our scope of the meeting today.
Oh, okay.
But what I'd like to do is Margaret has my contact information. And so after the meeting, this might be kind of an ongoing dialogue. Questions, you can forward them to me. Margaret can give you my email, and then I can get you to the right person at the city to answer those more technical questions.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Cheryl, that was great. And I just wanted to highlight kind of what we've all been going through with this new digital meeting normal. We have these technical glitches, but we all keep going. And Cheryl's a prime example of that right here. Yeah. No gap in service. Very, very helpful, Cheryl. Thank you. And so next up, it would be great if Mike McCarrow from Land Use.
Hello, everybody. And I will just mention Seda and I are extremely shy, so we're wearing our masks today. No, that's not the real reason. We just are implementing a new policy with statewide freeze. So since we're in cubicles and not in our own room, that is why we have these on. So hopefully you can hear okay. Let me know if I need to repeat anything. So I basically am a zoning person. You may have heard that. All of our zoning standards are in Chapter 9 of the Eugene Code called the Land Use Code. And so for somebody who wants to build a house, the things that our team would look for are things like, is it in the right zone? Cheryl mentioned zoning. Is it set back from the front property line the right distance, or the side or the rear property lines the right distance? Is it not too tall? It meets the height restrictions. And are there right number of parking spaces? And another common standard we have for residential is called a solar setback. And so that's a standard that is designed to allow sun to your neighbor to the north. And so there are some limitations on how close a structure, it's basically a 2-story is the only time it's impacted, how close a two-story structure can be to the north property line. And so for residential, that's kind of the basic standards that we look for. There's a 10-foot front yard setback for the main house, but an 18-foot setback from the front property line to the garage. I think Cheryl mentioned that. And it's always a good idea to check in with the public works team that Michelle is representing today to get that distance from the front property line to, from the vertical face of the curb to the front property line. A lot of people think, oh, the back of the sidewalk is the front property line, but it is almost never, ever at that location. So we can provide that for you, and that will help a lot with planning the design of the house. And we have the ability to take our mask off if we're eating. So I'm going to pretend to be eating something here in a minute. Oh, that's so much better. And hopefully you can hear me better. So for residential, we kind of covered those. Apartment buildings have their own standards. And so for apartments, of course, there's minimum number of parking. You have more landscaping requirements. There's a thing called density, where you have to have either a minimum or a maximum number of dwelling units based on the size of the lot, of the site. We like our apartment buildings to be oriented toward the street, be close to the street, have a front entrance towards the street, so we can promote neighbors looking out for each other and kind of have that feel. There's a maximum length of how long a apartment structure can be. We don't want to have monster buildings. And some of this depends on which zone they are located in. and there's pedestrian walkways from the street to all the other units on the complex. And that's just kind of a few of the standards for apartments. And then for commercial, some of you who've been downtown, well, we have several 120 foot tall multifamily in commercial zones downtown. And so that can be some pretty tall buildings. And there's a couple on Broadway and Franklin that are in the works that you'll see sometime soon. So, but for, let's say, a fast food place, we have standards that address drive-through uses. We want to make sure that we have a long enough queuing so people aren't backing up into the street, and some landscaping to try to buffer those drive-through uses. And so that's just a quick overview of some of the standards that we have, and you know, how this works, a little bit about process. Cheryl talked about that, but it's great that we do have our digital system. I was around with the paper world that Cheryl mentioned as well. And so now we do have a system called eBuild that you would prepare all of your digital files. And for residential, an example of that would be a site plan that would be an overhead view looking down on the lot, and it would show the street, the sidewalk, and where the property started. And then you'd have your house, maybe a garage, attached or detached. So we'd have a site plan that we would need to see. We also have to see an elevation plan so we can know how tall the house is and where the windows would be. And typically that would be all four sides of the building for your elevation plan. And that could sometimes be 2 on one sheet and 2 on another. So that'd be kind of a simple example of a layout for plans. There might be some detailed plans where residential building code staff would have to have other additional information. And so that's kind of the basics for land use. I wonder if anybody has any questions on those kind of topics or zoning in general.
I do.
I do.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Salinas.
What determines different zones? Because I know that there's like you were saying, some apartment complexes can be huge, but there are some apartment complexes that are in fact huge. So what determines that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have kind of a long range plan called the Metro Plan. And the city council, working with the planning commission, says, okay, this part of town is going to be commercial, this part of town is going to be industrial, residential, and those are kind of the general areas. And then property owners can say, well, I have this zoning, I want to change it to a different zone. It has to match up with a metro plan. And there's also things called refinement plans where different neighborhoods work together with the city and say, we want our neighborhood to look like this long term. So to do a zone change, if they don't like the zone that they have now, they would have to meet the metro plan, meet the policies and the refinement plan to maybe go from a small commercial to a larger commercial zone or something like that. So those are the things that generate zones, what kind of zone you can have. Another thing that's interesting is that we keep coming up with new ideas about how to make things more compatible, how to make them work better. And so we have old codes, some buildings you see, let's say fences, for example, fences in residential zones, you can no longer have a 6-foot fence right on your front property line. But if the fence was from a long time ago, that's what we call legal non-conforming status. And so you can keep that until it goes away. But right now, if you want to do a new fence, it'd only be 42 inches tall. So you might see buildings or other things that like, I don't think that meets the current code, but it probably has legal non-conforming status. Did that help with answering?
Yeah,
a little bit? Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you.
And then a follow-up, if someone wanted to learn more about the zoning and the land use codes and everything that's involved there, where should they go to learn about those things?
And I wonder if Garion would be willing to forward we have general information email addresses as well as telephone numbers. For example, 2 of the 5 people on my team help with answering those questions on a daily basis. And that might be
great.
a central resource that you could distribute to the students, and they could check in with all the different teams that work at the city, and so you can get good information for your project.
That would be great. Thank you.
Happy to do that. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Garion.
I had a quick question. Is there, like, with land use and stuff, I know you talked about houses as far as sun and stuff, but does Lane County have like a cap for its commercial buildings? Like, we can only go this high, we can't compete with like the size of buildings that are in Portland, or is that part of the metro plan, or?
Well, and those regulations such as height are in our land use code, called one of the development standards. And so downtown, other commercial zones, even some industrial zones, although you don't see tall industrial buildings typically, there is a maximum of 120 feet. So the Hub apartment building downtown on Broadway is one of our first buildings that recently that got that tall. It is right at 120 feet. And so that is the maximum height for commercial.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. That was very informative and great questions too. So next up, we have Michelle from Public Works.
Hi. So I work for Public Works, and when I'm doing review, I'm looking at the public wastewater system and a development site's connection to it, the public stormwater system, access to the road system, sidewalks. We also review for water quality, that's treatment of your stormwater before discharging it to the destination. There's other standards that are source controls, which include some of the contaminated site requirements. We have material transfer. There's a bunch of specific regulations in reference to that I don't need to go into. We review for floodplain development permits, and we assess systems development charges, which are fees that help pay for the increased impact to our infrastructure that's non-assessable. So what that means is if you have a wastewater line and it's 8 inches and you have a bunch of homes connecting to it, at some point that 8-inch pipe will have to become larger because of the volume of effluent running through it. And so systems development charges will help pay for that cost to upgrade that infrastructure, based on the amount of properties connected and the size of those properties and the amount of their effluent. That's not it. We also have there's 5 systems. So we have the conveyance of wastewater, we have the treatment plant for wastewater, we have the stormwater system, the transportation system, and the park system. So those are the 5 systems that we charge for. EWEB charges for a water SDC, but we don't here at the building permit services. It's very interesting. Some of the things I had written down to make sure that I highlighted for people, they've already commented on. An important thing is knowing where your property lines are. Those property lines do not correlate with the street surface, whether that's curb and gutter or whether it's an asphalt mat. They also don't relate to fences. Many times, I would even say most of the time, fences are not actually on the property line. They had intended to, but they tend to deviate as you're installing them, and many times they cross over the property line. Another thing to kind of keep in mind are easements. So we have public utility easements. We have some record of private easements. not very many, but we do have some. And so like we don't allow encroachments into a public utility easement. So let's say that we have along a property line, a 7-foot public utility easement. Somebody wants to build an accessory building, and land use says, okay, but that accessory building can't be closer than 5 feet from the property line, but we have a 7-foot public utility easement. We won't let you encroach into that public utility easement either. So that's pushing that building even farther away. Plus, with land use, their 5 feet allows encroachments like the roof, while within a public utility easement, we don't. So that can, if you've got 1 or 2 foot overhangs, that's even moving your building that much farther away from the property line. So that's why it's important to know where those easements are. There are times that we allow encroachments through a permit process called a revocable permit. That's kind of a long process, but it is an option. Typically, we'll see that when for commercial projects, they'll encroach into public utility easements. Sometimes back in the day when somebody was platting a subdivision, they would just put public utility easements adjacent to all property lines or most property lines. But there's no utilities in those easements. So in a case like that, the revocable permit process allows you to find out that there's no easements there, and then we have you get concurrences from those utilities, and then we can allow you to encroach. So there are options, but it's very important to know about it. Nothing's worse than going through the design process only to find out that you can't build what you want because it's encroaching into an easement that has improvements in it, so we can't allow it. Well, let's see here. Yeah, I would really, really, really encourage people to utilize our public information staff. So we refer to them as our counter staff because we normally have a counter. Right now it's just a virtual counter. So it's a phone number with voicemail and an email. But because the way our regulations are, you can have one property that is subject to a particular code and the property right next to it may not be subject, or vice versa. So it's really important for you to utilize those resources to ask about the sites, you know, from land use, from public work, all of those people. It's better to have the correct information than to find out after design that you need to make changes. Also, one thing to kind of keep in mind as you're drawing plans, that there's a kind of a balancing act between how much information to put on a plan and when to separate a plan out so that you can be more clear. You know, that's just one of those things you kind of have to keep in mind. But my personal thought is that for permit purposes, it's being as clear on the plan as possible. What you're trying to do is communicate your design as it relates to the regulation. And so I would recommend erring on the side of clarity, therefore having maybe additional plans. On commercial projects, we see this a lot, right? We'll have multiple civil sheets. A residential plan, sometimes people try to put everything on the site plan. And the reality is that it might behoove you to pull some of that information onto a separate plan. So just that would be sort of my pro tip, would be to consider clarity versus, you know, everything on one sheet. And that's it, unless you guys have questions.
I had a question. So if you were, is there a minimum and a maximum for a septic tank to be from the dwelling?
Well, so here's the interesting thing. Septic permits are all issued through Lane County, through the sanitarians. So when we're doing a permit and someone's proposing a septic system, we require that they just submit a copy of that issued septic permit. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to say probably, but I don't know what those dimensions would be. And so the sanitarians at Lane County, their names are George Ellers and Jay Matheson. And they're a wonderful resource to tap in.
All right, thank you.
I think one other thing I'd wanted to say is that for single family dwellings right now, our average SDC for what we call a medium tier, so it's a footprint of between 1,000 and 3,000 square feet. That's a first floor footprint. You're looking at $11,000. So it's not small. I have one of the big apartment complexes that Mike was talking about on Hilliard and Franklin. They're looking at SDCs, including previous credits, and they're still over $1 million. So SDCs are and can be very huge. So
are you talking about that's the cost of the permits?
Nope, that's just for systems development charges.
Oh.
And then there's permit.
And then there's permits, and yeah.
Gotta add every bit.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. That was really informative. And it sounds, I wanted to reiterate after this, I'm going to send out an email to Margaret with our general info, voicemail and email contact for all the departments that are being represented today, as well as a link to the state building code. So you can see the residential code, commercial code, what's being in place now, a link to eBuild, which is how the city of Eugene accepts permits. We're all digital, even before Corona, which was actually very helpful for our jurisdiction because we've been able to navigate this more or less fairly seamlessly. And with that little intermission, I'd like to turn it over to Seda now. Seda will have an opportunity to talk about residential, and then I'll talk about commercial. And Zoom hasn't kicked us off yet. It's 10:41.
Great. So. Oh, that's good news.
All right, Seda.
Good morning. So for starters, I want to talk about my role. So I'm a residential plans reviewer here. So that means that I'm reviewing plans for compliance with the 2017 Oregon Residential Specialty Code that will be updated next year, I believe, to the 2021, or maybe it's the 2020. It's typically a 3-year cycle. And I also act as project coordinator, which means that I'm the person who takes all the documents and routes them to different reviewers and integrates all the different information from the different reviewers involved in any one permit, with the exception of erosion permits, because Dal or the erosion staff will take care of those completely. With the caveat that intake does the initial routing to all the different reviewers. First, for process, get familiar with our website. There's a ton of information on there, and it's really useful. When submitting residential documents, make sure that your file names are correct. It really helps when they are actually relevant to what is on the plans. I've seen some where things just seem to be named randomly. It also really helps if the names are simple. So 01 floor plan or 03 roof plan, something like that, rather than getting into the project name and the who the applicant is and so on and so forth, or like, you have section floor plans and something else. Names can get really long and unwieldy.
Then when you do make a submittal, if you have multiple documents, it's really helpful if you submit them all at one time rather than submitting one at a time. It's really important to consider when doing a plan, consider the purpose of the permit documents. The purpose is to demonstrate compliance with the code. There's 3 relevant code sections in the Oregon Residential Specialty Code that specify what that is. First is our 106.1.1, which states that the construction documents shall be of sufficient clarity to indicate the location, nature, and extent of the work proposed, and to show in detail that it complies with the code. So we will get some plans that don't show detail. So for instance, they'll have something like rafters attached to ledger board or something of that nature. That doesn't give us the information we need. We need to know how that ledger is attached. So is it like SDS screws, 2 SDS screws, 16 inches on center? Is it baling wire and duct tape? We need to know exactly what it is that can makes those connections in that kind of situation. Then another section is on wall bracing. So the requirement is to show the location and specify wall bracing methods, which is for lateral force resisting systems, earthquake and seismic, earthquake and wind loads. And then the final is the site plan, which people have talked about before. And some really important things to note when doing the plan. I highly recommend that you get familiar with the Oregon Residential Specialty Code. Oh, I want to back up just a little bit here. I talked about not enough information. There's also too much information. So get familiar with the, we have a handout, no permit required. And that has the things that you do not require a permit for. You don't really need to include that in detail. So for instance, sometimes we'll see some of the interior design firms that do remodeling will have like all of the building code is really regulating might be removal of a wall, of a bearing wall, and replacing it with a beam. And there will be like 10 pages of documents which are mostly about the detailed design drawings of cabinets which don't require permit. So it can take a lot of extra time, both for the designer, but also for the plans reviewer, because we have to look through all those documents that aren't relative for compliance with code in case there might be something. Then when doing a plan, there's 2 kind of ways to do compliance with code. One is what we call the prescriptive code, which is using systems that are defined within the code. So there's prescriptive wall bracing, there's header sizes, there's rafters and so on. And the other is engineered design. And with engineered design, you're getting into things that can go beyond the limits of the prescriptive code, because the prescriptive code is really useful, but it's also really limited in its scope. So engineered lumber is typically something that would be designed rather than prescriptive. There's also wall bracing systems that if you want to have a big window wall or something, you're going to end up designing it. And as you think about that, a really important code section, and it might be a good idea to write this one down, is R 301.2.2.2 in the Oregon Code, seismic limitations, and it includes a number of factors, including dead load factors and different definitions of irregular buildings. If you're planning on doing prescriptive design, and you should always check that first, because some of those, if it's irregular, then it is required to be designed and you'll need to hire an engineer. Another thing to be aware of is soils. So you can ask us. We have resources that can give us an idea of soils, but especially if you're building on a slope, you may have like, there are some areas where landsliding is extremely likely. And in those cases, we will require geotechnical evaluation prior to permit issuance. So it's a good idea to check with us about soils. And also related to that can be retaining walls, which also frequently need to be designed. So if you're holding back a slope or making a big cut in a slope, something like that, then that would be something that would require design. And I think that's it, unless you have questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I think you said geotech is who would be necessary to go and check the soil, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we get into contact with you, but would you guys organize that, like for someone to come out and look at it, or how does that work?
No, we would only be able to give you an idea of what kind of soils are on the site, and that is a very general idea. It's not specific. So the geotech would be hiring a registered design professional, typically an engineer, structural civil engineer, who will go on site and actually test the soil on site and determine the qualities of the soil and whether it, might be shifting or there's a lot of clay soil around here that has really high shrink swell that can really play havoc on your foundation and make our local helical pier installers rich. And then there's also like the slope, like landsliding and stuff.
Okay, thank you.
I have a supplemental question to that. So, I've submitted some plans, and you might come back to me and indicate that, we recognize there's a problem with the soil in this area, because I wouldn't necessarily know that to begin with. Is that how that would go down?
It can, or you can check with us ahead of time. If there's something, on a flat site, it might not be a big deal. Typically on flat sites, if there's high shrink swell potential in the soil, we will require the geotech, but it won't be required for approval of the permit. If it's on a slope, depending on its relation to the slope and probability of landsliding, we may require it ahead of time. There are also certain cases where there may be fills that are not designed or other unknown soil qualities or compositions that may require soils report prior to building permit issuance. But again, if there's any question about the soils, probably the best thing to do is contact us and we can give you a sort of general idea. Is this something you're going to need for sure? Is it something that might come up in the process? Or is it something, that you can pass on? It's probably a good idea in general to do that consideration with the soils, because the house is only as good as its foundation.
And if the soil survey says you have a certain soil type in this part of your site, that's kind of historical information, but how do you or we know that there has not been some cut or fill there that we didn't know about? Where does one find those records?
We may not know until work actually commences.
Mm-hmm.
It may be something that's discovered during excavation. But for a lot of it, like one example is there is a large development going on in North Eugene where there used to be a golf course. On that golf course, we know that it used to be a golf course, and there's a lot of fill on that was never designed. So if it's in that subdivision, we're going to be requiring a soils report prior to any building permit being issued. There are other cases where in the process of creating a subdivision, the applicant will involve a soils engineer in that, and there will be like a subdivision soils report. And in those, frequently there will be certain sites will be identified as having soil characteristics that do not require any follow-up. Others will be identified as needing site-specific analysis. So there's different ways of doing it. In general, if there's a slope, we're going to be looking at that, whether or not it's, you know, undisturbed soil or not.
These are all great questions. Thank you. And thank you, Seda, for providing the informative piece about including the code sections. One more time, what was that code section? The 130?
R301.2.2.2. This can save a lot of time, because if you don't know that it's an irregular building and you do a prescriptive design, only then in the process of doing the plan review, we discover, oh, this needs to be designed. It can cause a pretty major slowdown, because if the engineers are busy, then you may be a month or even more out before you can even get the design to resubmit that portion of the plan. So being aware of whether or not you will need design before you submit can be a really really helpful. It can also help with budgeting for it, because if you are assuming that you won't need an engineer and then you need to hire an engineer, they don't come cheap.
Thank you, Seda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about commercial. I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we will wrap it up here at 11. And I just wanted to pause and say thank you to Margaret and the students for being here, and my awesome colleagues. I've learned some stuff today. Really appreciate your time. So for commercial, I'm a commercial plans examiner. When we're drafting, building on what some of my team members have said, it does come down to a balance of information. What's too much, what's not enough. So I could give an example for me. When I was coming up, I always wondered, how long should I take this dimension string? What do I need to show exactly on the plans? And for example, the more you have an understanding of what codes are in effect in the jurisdiction where you're submitting a permit, the more it'll become clear which, for example, dimensions are going to be important to include on the plans. And then just the basics, I'm sure you've already gone over all of this, but always making sure to include things like a scale and a north arrow. Basically, it helps your plans examiners orient themselves, because while you may have visited the site, like as Dal and Michelle and Mike has suggested, we haven't. And so anything you can do to make that review efficient is ultimately going to save your customer or your business some time and money. I would encourage you, I'm going to send the links out to Margaret after the class. The state of Oregon, all of the jurisdictions adopt the same commercial building code. So that means once you kind of get an idea of what one jurisdiction is doing, you could work in many different jurisdictions with that kind of knowledge. So I'll send a link out to that. The building codes, unfortunately, you can't print them out. They want you to pay for them, but they are read only. So there are some valuable information there. For the city of Eugene specifically, we have an awesome program, which as you move forward in your career, if you are working for a contractor or an architect or an engineer or for yourself, and you're doing small scale commercial projects, we have a commercial express permit program, and I'll send out a link to that. I think, and I'll open it up to questions here in a second for commercial. I did just want to point out, moving forward, one of the best things about working for the city is not just the work is interesting. You know, if you're a nerd like me, it's pretty fascinating stuff. But I hope you're able to see with my colleagues here today, it matters. Your team, we work together. These permits, they touch many different hands, and we rely on each other to provide feedback and ultimately to do the best service we can to the customer in our community, especially during times like this, you know, where we're seeing things we've never seen before. So with that, I'm gonna close it down on the commercial. I'm always available to answer any specific questions, but I wanted to turn it over to Margaret and the students before we close out. Are there any questions?
So, more questions.
Of course, I have a question.
Yes.
So I don't need to get, I mean, I don't want to keep people here very long, but speak for a minute about phased approval. I mean, there are some huge projects and that's the reaction I expect because I'm sure it's a pain. But like Hayward Field, the new Hayward Field, there is no way that they knew exactly how everything was going to go before they walked out with their permit for that project. Is that difficult to keep up with? I mean, tell me a little bit about that. That's got to be really hard.
Oh, it's a great question. And so phased permits, exactly what you're saying. If we know, for example, the basic idea of what a building's going to be, but say, you know, because of the weather or the financial forecast, we've got to get our foundations done, maybe before the rest of the building is even designed. So phased permits are typically split out, from what I've seen, into 2 phases. And Hayward may have more. I can talk about Hayward specifically. So typically the site work and foundations would be on phase 1. And we review them with kind of the general idea of what the engineering loads are going to be on the superstructure, for example, lateral or seismic or gravity or wind loads. And so by putting that in one phase and working with our designers and our contractors, it allows their team to keep moving forward and pour that concrete when the weather is good, or when they can get the trucks down from Portland when it's a big project like Hayward. And then while that's happening, it also allows the designers to keep moving forward on the design of the actual building. As a jurisdiction, I can speak for us, the way we're set up, we can actually review all of the phases concurrently. So if we have a fast track project, we can do that. We can issue that permit because it may take a little bit less time for the foundation permit to be reviewed while we're still reviewing the superstructure. So it's a great question. And the simple answer is we phase the permits so that we can work as closely as we can with the design team and the owners to realize their project in a safe and code compliant way. Did that answer your question?
Can I add a little bit in here? So one other thing, phased permits are required to have a phased permit meeting ahead of time. And so large ones like Hayward Field, which I worked on, and the Knight campus, they'll have multiple project consultations. So you'll have a project consultation at a very conceptual level. Then they'll come in for another one when they're sort of fleshing out more of their concrete ideas. And then as they have to make modifications based on particular codes, then they may come in one other time. There are times on those larger projects like that where they also have to go through land use applications. Sometimes those land use applications run concurrently as well. And so just to let you know that there's additional complexities and additional levels that can be involved in those larger projects.
Thank you for clarifying, Michelle. That's very helpful.
Darian, I
yes.
might jump in.
Yes,
I have
please.
a weekly staff meeting that I'm afraid I need to attend, so I will say goodbye for now.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to close it out now, but first, the last thing I wanted to say is I always encourage, I mean, you're here today. It's amazing what the students are doing right now, even just showing up to this. We appreciate it. And I would encourage you, in the email I'm going to send out to Margaret, I like to include a link to City of Eugene jobs. We are currently in a hiring freeze, as you may have read. But basically, if you sign up for these emails, when the jobs do become open, it'll come right to your inbox. Basically, that's how I first heard about this job. I wasn't, it just came to my inbox. And even if there, say, for example, may not be a position in the building department, there's lots of great teams here at the city. There's lots of great opportunities to build your experience. You can move laterally. And again, if you are interested in serving the community and want to be part of a great team, a nimble team that enjoys working with each other and working for our community, I would encourage you to sign up with that link that I'm going to send.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Margaret, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I just want to thank all of you for spending so much time and care on this. I think you have all put a lot of thought and effort into making this valuable, and we truly appreciate it. It really means a lot. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very, very much for all of you who came and talked to us. It was a lot of useful information for me. So.
It sure
Awesome.
was.
Yeah, and I want to thank you too. You know, I talk about the building department and what they can expect, and this just this, you know, wanting to work with people and get this stuff done legally, and just, you know, this used to be an adversarial kind of relationship between builders and the darn building department, but I don't think it's really like that anymore. And maybe it was just, I don't think it was just me, but no,
Yeah.
I mean, things have changed. They really have. And I want
That's
people to
awesome.
recognize that, and that we're all on the same team, you know, so thank you.
We are on the same team. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks again. Have a good day.
All right, I'm going to close out the meeting and send the
Thank you.
video along to Margaret. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Appreciate it.
so
Have a great
much.
day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.